I woke up, wrote the rest of the monologue, and performed it on The Tonight Show, after having a dream about a nervous guy. As the endearing Barney Fay, Don Knotts made America laugh for decades. However, everything changed when his daughter discovered his personal writings. Behind the well-known smile was a violent upbringing that would follow him for the rest of his life. When he was a toddler, his own father put knives to his throat. He was unable to leave his bed prior to important performances, and had a covert prescription drug addiction. His secret depression caused his marriages to fall apart. The man who brought joy to everyone was concealing such intense pain that it almost destroyed him. On July 21, 1924, Don Knotts was born in Morgantown, West Virginia. Arriving 14 years after his next oldest brother, he was the youngest of 4 sons. A month prior, his parents had lost their farm. After being crushed by the Great Depression, they were forced to live in a rented boarding house. Later, Don acknowledged that he was born with little hope. His family was already emotionally and financially exhausted and worn down. His arrival was initially perceived as more of a burden than a benefit. William Knotts, Don's father, was afflicted with schizophrenia, excessive drinking, and a condition known as hysterical blindness. Don's father used to get violently angry when he was still a toddler. He would brandish knives at him, pin Don to the wall, and yell threats. He even occasionally put blades to Don's throat. Don was only 2 or 3 years old when these moments began. His father was admitted to an institution after multiple hospital stays. Don was 13 when he passed away. He never completely recovered from the fear of those formative years. Don battled anxiety and severe depression as an adult, constantly seeking safety that he had never experienced as a child. It was a small, dangerous house. Don slept in the kitchen, and his father frequently reclined on the couch in the living room, which was directly on the route to the rest of the house. Traveling late at night felt like a game of life or death. Don might encounter a knife or yelled threats if his father stirred. He was always afraid. At one point, his mother asked him if he could recall the moment his father put a knife to his throat. Though he remained silent, the memories persisted. Don became pale, frequently ill, and terrified to walk around his own home. There was no defense from his elder brothers. They were already ensnared in alcoholism and were over 10 years older. Rather than assisting Don, they made fun of him, teased him, and made him feel isolated. Shadow, one of the brothers, died young after making cruel jokes. Only his mischievous behavior is remembered. Don wasn't merely afraid, he felt unwelcome. There was nowhere safe for him, not from his own thoughts, not from his brothers, not from his father. Despite his deep sadness, Don managed to find ways to escape. At an early age, he began to create characters, create voices, and perform. To amuse anyone who would listen, he constructed a dummy named Danny. This provided him with a place to hide, a means of connection, and a tiny sense of power. He even performed with Danny for soldiers in the Pacific theater of World War II. He later acknowledged, however, that he detested the dummy. He threw Danny overboard and claimed he was missing in action one day following a performance. A turning point was reached at that moment. Instead of performing as a puppet, Don wanted to be himself. He wasted no time after graduating from high school in 1942. He took a bus to New York City, with Danny in hand just a few weeks after turning 18. He thought he was prepared for the spotlight. However, the city disagreed. His performance was a complete failure. Agents of casting were not impressed. He went back to Morgantown in silence, poor and jobless. At a grocery store, he cleaned chickens while attempting to get over the humiliation. But he clung to the dream despite losing. Don was drafted into the Army in 1943. He signed a waiver and went, despite being 1 pound under the weight limit. After joining the Special Services branch, he appeared on the Stars and Gripes variety show for soldiers. After starting with Danny, he quickly came to the conclusion that ventriloquism was not his calling. He gave it up entirely and concentrated on comedy. After receiving support from other performers, he honed the twitchy, anxious personality that would eventually become his signature. He found his voice and received multiple medals by the time he left the Army in 1946. He threw himself into acting when he returned home and enrolled at West Virginia University. He performed in every play he could while studying English because the school did not offer a drama major. In 1948, he received his degree. He fell in love with Catherine Metz, a Baptist minister's daughter, at this time. In 1947, they tied the knot in a modest Wheeling church. Don wasn't well known at the time. The marriage gave him strength, but the wedding hardly made the local news. Even when his wild dreams had nothing, Catherine encouraged them. Don borrowed $100 and gambled on New York once more in 1949. He had military friends, experience, and a wife who supported him this time. Still, it wasn't simple. Despite being rejected frequently, he managed to land a small radio role as Windy Wales, a smoldering old cowboy on The Bobby Benson Show. For 6 years, the show ran. He then found work in soap operas and small clubs. He portrayed a young man who was deeply troubled on the soap opera Search for Tomorrow from 1953 to 1955. The character would only talk to his sister because he was so damaged. Unexpectedly, Don excelled at his one and only dramatic role. On a show that aired when most TV wasn't even recorded yet, he performed live week after week. Although it wasn't very much, the pay was consistent. That meant everything to a young actor in the early 1950s. In addition to providing Don with money, that show also gave him security and the freedom to pursue his dreams of doing something completely different. When Don appeared on The Steve Allen Show in 1956, that dream gained attention. Millions of people watched the fast-paced, chaotic variety show, and Don immediately made an impression. He never yelled, sang, or made loud jokes. He portrayed a scared character, frightened, in fact. In interviews, he became the shaky-handed surgeon, the poor guy who had to replace the pins and hand grenades, and the trembling guy. Viewers were unable to turn away. His voice cracked, his eyes grew wide, and all of a sudden, nervousness was amusing. Very amusing. The anxious man was a character that stayed with him throughout his life. To the public, it became who he was. People laughed more each time he stumbled and flinched on screen. It wasn't merely a hit. It turned into his signature. Fans were unaware that the fear was more than a facade. Don was genuinely anxious. Off-screen, he was so anxious that he occasionally couldn't leave his bed before important performances. He would be struck like a wall by the fear. He sought help from therapists and made every effort to control it, but it never totally disappeared. He suffered because of what made audiences laugh. Nevertheless, he persisted in pushing through it. Real pain was the source of his twitchy, uncertain stage presence, which was his greatest strength as a performer. His characters had depth because of that vulnerability. They were human, not merely goofy. The year 1955 was the most significant turning point. Don was cast in a small part in No Time for Sergeants, a Broadway comedy. Andy Griffith, a comic from the South with a natural charm, was the star. Don's appearance was short, but what transpired backstage would alter the course of events. Andy and he clicked. They became good friends over 7 performances. Don came after the play was made into a film in 1958. More work was not the only outcome of that connection. The Andy Griffith Show was the result. The Andy Griffith Show did not have a plan for a clumsy deputy when it began in 1960. Don Knotts, however, had different plans. He had just seen the pilot after leaving the Steve Allen Show. "You're going to be a sheriff. You'll need yourself a deputy," he told Andy Griffith over the phone as soon as he finished watching it. The world met Barney Fay, the overconfident deputy with only one bullet in his shirt pocket. Within weeks after Andy told him to call the producer, Sheldon Leonard. By the second episode, Andy realized something important. This strange little man might be the true star of the show. They clicked right away. Barney Fay was named the 9th greatest TV character of all time by TV Guide years later. Don Knotts won 5 Emmys for his role as Barney between 1960 and 1965, including 1961, 1962, 1963, 1966, and 1967. No other supporting actor in a comedy had ever done so at the time. Despite the fact that celebrities like George C. Don was painting a fence in his backyard when he received the call regarding his first nomination, and he later stated, "I had always been a prepared loser." Scott and Robert Redford were everywhere, and Don's nervous, buggy deputy kept beating them. But he continued to win year after year. No one had surpassed his streak by 2025. At first, Andy Griffith wanted to be the one with the jokes, but when Don played the idiot and played it straight in the second episode, Manhunt, he realized how much stronger the show was. That change shaped everything. Later, Andy said, "I knew by that episode that Don should be the comic and I should play straight. That made all the difference." While Andy stood quietly next to him, it allowed Don the room he needed to be boisterous, apprehensive, and hilarious. Their timing served as a model for later sitcoms. The characters' connection felt genuine, and the laughter came more quickly. The show was popular in addition to being humorous. The Andy Griffith Show never fell below 7th place in the Nielsen ratings between 1960 and 1968. It was the most popular show in America at the end of its last season. Seinfeld and I Love Lucy are the only ones who have done that. Barney wasn't merely a supporting character. He became the most adored face. In order to feel more connected to the Mayberry universe, some fans even relocated to Andy's hometown of Mount Airy. 5 million Americans continue to watch the show daily in 1998. Every year, Mayberry Days continues to unite fans in North Carolina. However, Don's life was considerably more difficult behind the scenes. Even before Mayberry, in the 1950s, he was prescribed anxiety medication by doctors. His silent prescription drug addiction resulted from his frequent health anxieties and panic attacks. He was unable to leave his bed for shows at his worst. He accidentally took too many sleeping pills once his private life suffered. His family and marriages suffered. However, he retaliated. He abruptly stopped taking the pills following a health scare and a firm warning from his third wife. In 1965, he also quit The Andy Griffith Show. By doing so, he left the role that served to mask the fear he harbored within. Don had a plan before he left. He signed a 5-picture deal with Universal Pictures because he thought the show would end after season 5. But Andy made the decision to continue. It was too late by that time. Don had made a commitment. The change was not well received by fans. Nobody was able to take Barney's place, despite Jerry Van Dyke's best efforts. Don returned for guest appearances in 1966 and 1967, winning 2 more Emmys for those performances. He now had 5, which is still the most for a single supporting comic role. The Amazing Mr. Limpet gave Don his big break in the film industry in 1964, with Don portraying a timid man who transforms into a fish and aids the Navy in battling German submarines. It combined live action and animation. People adored it, but critics weren't sure. TV reruns turned it into a cult classic over time. Lew Wasserman of Universal gave Don a long-term contract because he was so impressed. Don was able to sell tickets without Barney Fay, thanks to that one movie. Don starred in a series of popular comedies for Universal, beginning in 1966. Made for $670,000, Ghost and Mr. Chicken soon made 5 times that amount. Then came The Reluctant Astronaut in 1967, which nearly doubled its cost in just 6 months, earning $1.5 million. In 1968, he released The Shackiest Gun in the West. Don became more than just a humorous TV character thanks to these films. He became a consistent draw at the box office. He and Tim Conway collaborated on Disney's The Apple Dumpling Gang in 1975. Their chemistry was flawless. Families enjoyed their silly slapstick, and the movie was so successful that Disney produced a follow-up 4 years later. People of all ages found humor in Don. He demonstrated his ability to lead a hit even outside of Universal. Through the middle of the 1970s, his films helped Disney maintain its dominance in family entertainment. Don Knotts was more than just a television personality by the late 1960s. He was among America's most well-known faces. Interviews were sought after by magazines. His signature was sought after by studios. He used to be one of the highest-paid comedians in the nation. The cumulative revenue from his films over the years exceeded $500 million worldwide. Barney Fay was no longer Don Knotts. An entire movie could be carried by his apprehensive charm. Particularly in the Midwest and the South, his name alone could draw crowds to the theater. To cast him, the studios battled. They were aware of his contributions. In 1947, Don Knotts wed Catherine Metz, his college sweetheart. He was unknown, broke, and still figuring out his life's purpose at that point. Catherine supported him during his gradual ascent into show business for 17 years. However, everything at home started to fall apart right after he finally found his calling on The Andy Griffith Show. Don received his first Emmy in 1961. The marriage ended in 1964. He was now one of the most identifiable figures on TV. However, there was a price for the success. He was now juggling the constant demands of celebrity with the upbringing of their 2 children, Thomas and Karen. At the time, Karen was just 10 years old. Behind the TV smiles, the real world was anything but happy. Don's personal life never fully recovered, and the strain caused the marriage to break down. Don made another attempt 10 years later. He wed Laura Lee Chuckna in 1974. She worked in show business as well, and for a little while everything appeared stable. However, that tranquility was short-lived. Nerves had always been a problem for Don. However, it became impossible to overlook his depression. and fear of getting sick during this marriage. Even though the doctors couldn't find anything wrong, he would sometimes lie in bed believing he was dying. His moods could change so quickly, according to his daughter Karen. Not even relatives knew who they would be interacting with. Although Laura Lee tried her hardest to help him, life behind closed doors was exhausting. Even though Don was still charming in public, his thoughts were frequently darker in private. Though few were aware of how severely it affected his marriage, rumors circulated throughout Hollywood that he was in a fragile state. Nevertheless, Laurie remained by his side through some of his darkest years. The diagnosis that altered everything then came. Don was diagnosed with macular degeneration in 1979. He was just 57. Playing Ralph Furley on Three's Company, he was in the midst of a comeback at the time. It couldn't have come at a worse time. He was afraid because his vision was rapidly deteriorating. He was identified by his eyes. People laughed because of those broad, animated expressions. He now feared that he would never be able to read a script without assistance, or see his children's faces clearly again. He was overcome with fear. According to Laurel, he began discussing a bucket list, as though he was running out of time. He stopped going out. He stayed away from mirrors. He spent days in bed. It was similar to witnessing someone vanish in front of you. Between 1979 and 1983, I controlled everything, because he was afraid of losing his sight. Don declined to go to therapy. He shoved people away. Tension increased in the house, and the arguments became commonplace. In 1983, Laura Lee finally departed. She claimed that after 9 years of marriage, they were destroyed by his fear of going blind. It was too late to repair what had already been lost, even though surgery later helped restore some of his vision. Years of silence and anxiety had eroded the marriage. It demonstrated that even a man renowned for making millions of people happy wasn't always able to maintain harmony in his own household. Strangely enough, his career was resurrected by the same show that coincided with his health crisis. When the Ropers departed, and a new character was required in 1979, Don joined Three's Company. Don returned to the limelight as Ralph Furley at the age of 54. With his outrageous attire and impeccable comedic timing, he infused the show with vitality and ridiculousness. Even if they were unfamiliar with his earlier work, younger audiences adored him. The writers gave Don more screen time after Suzanne Summers left in 1981. He filled the void with ease. He was once again a key player in a huge TV hit by the time the show concluded in 1984. Despite fighting vision loss behind the scenes, his role allowed him to embark on a new chapter in his life. Don grinned and made jokes as the cameras rolled. Off-camera, however, he was having more difficulties than anyone knew. It took longer to read the scripts. On set, he occasionally failed to recognize faces. He eventually had to stop driving. For fear of being branded a liability, he kept the majority of this information secret. He once told friends that he was afraid of losing his jobs if they found out. The reality was harsh. He was losing his vision, and it included elements of the career he had spent decades developing. Nevertheless, he arrived. He gave a performance. Even some coworkers were unaware of what he was going through because he wore the mask so well. But it was all felt by his family. The house became quiet, Laurel Lee recalled. On some days, Don hardly spoke. According to Karen, his moods would fluctuate so drastically that nobody could predict which version of her father would enter the house. He became tense, aloof, and occasionally irate. Friends also noticed the change. In the rehearsal phase, he was less playful. Before he flipped the switch, he remained silent until it was time to perform. He frequently returned home exhausted afterward. The depression loomed over everything for over a year, but to the general public, he remained the endearing, smiling face from television. It was a devastating contrast. Finally, a breakthrough occurred. In Los Angeles, Don discovered a specialist developing a novel laser technique. Don had the surgery, even though it was costly, risky, and still in its early stages. It was successful. After receiving treatment for the leaking blood vessels in his eye, he was able to regain most of his central vision. It wasn't flawless. It restored his independence, but he never read quite the same way again. He was back on the set 2 months later. He thanked the doctors who helped him and sobbed with his family. He looked forward rather than back for the first time in years. Growing up, Karen Knotts was unaware of her father's entire history. She discovered things years later that altered her perspective on everything. The man who made America laugh for decades, Don Knotts, was raised in a fear-filled household. Don shared a home in Morgantown, West Virginia, in the 1920s, with a father who battled alcoholism and schizophrenia. Frequently, that combination descended into violence. His own father brandished a knife at him one evening. To get through the house safely, Don had to slip past the sofa. His elder brothers were of no assistance. They occasionally joined in. Because he was always afraid, he appeared thin and pale. Karen said it felt like it was soaking into the house. A handmade ventriloquist dummy was his only solace. Even so, it was an escape rather than a pleasure. Something inside him broke when his older brother Sid passed away from an asthma attack. Don lived the rest of his life with the wound from that loss. Not only did Karen's findings provide a fresh perspective on her father's early years, they altered the way that people perceived the suffering that underlies his humor. Don acknowledged that he felt like a failure, despite having 5 Emmys and a career spanning more than 50 years. "I felt like a loser," he once remarked. He was a legend to the world thanks to shows like Three's Company and The Andy Griffith Show. But I was generally unhappy. He was still that scared little boy on the inside, though. He attended counseling. He struggled to control his anger, sometimes even toward God. Despite his constant search, he was never able to find peace. His experience demonstrated that childhood trauma does not simply go away with achievement. It persists. It molds every aspect of your identity. Fans saw a very different Don at home than they did on screen. Karen saw him in 2 different guises. The happy one everyone adored, and the one who, when no one was around, descended into profound melancholy. She had to help him get out of those bad moods when he was a kid. She claimed to have behaved like a miniature shrink. Despite having a violent father and an alcoholic brother as children, Don never allowed that darkness to affect his own kids. He was kind. He exercised caution. He ensured that they would never experience what he had. Later in life, therapy was helpful, but the biggest impact came from Karen's support. It could have been much more difficult without her. Don married Frances Yarborough in 2002. He was 78 years old. They had collaborated on the sitcom, What a Country, nearly 2 decades prior. Despite Frances being more than 30 years younger, they had a strong bond. In his last years, she provided him with solace. His health was deteriorating by that point. He had lung cancer and macular degeneration. Frances became his closest friend, his helper, and his partner. They led a calm but loving life together. Don died in 2006, leaving his estate to Frances. That was a clear indication of how much she had grown to mean to him. Don had at last found peace after all the suffering of his early years. Early in the new millennium, Don was diagnosed with lung cancer. Even though he had given up smoking over a decade prior, it was insufficient. Nevertheless, he handled the illness amusingly. That was the unique aspect of his story. He joked when the doctors broke the news to him. He made his family laugh when the chemotherapy stopped working. He didn't let melancholy win, even though he knew time was running out. He had already escaped almost going blind. He continued to fight with jokes, because he understood what it meant to fight. He maintained a cheerful demeanor as his illness worsened, and he spent his final days at home. He was more than just a comedian. That's how he got by. In those final days, Karen was there, and she recalled something that would stay with her forever. Don continued to crack jokes despite his physical decline. She had to leave the room because one of them made her laugh so hard. It was beautiful, but she felt ashamed. She had received one final chuckle from her father. For a brief instant, the hospital room vanished, and everything seemed to be fine. His gift was that he bid them farewell in this manner. However, his last joke was not heard by Karen. She was no longer in the room, and it was too late when she returned. It had slipped her mind. She recalled that moment and later said, "I should have just stood there and blasted out laughing." She wasn't haunted by grief. It was the opportunity she lost to share a final laugh with him. That experience turned into a lesson that laughter is worthwhile even in the end. That smiling is sometimes the best way to say goodbye. The death of Don Knotts occurred on February 24, 2006. He was 81. He passed away from lung cancer and respiratory issues, but not before leaving the world in the same state that he had entered. Andy Griffith and other family members and friends were all around him. Even at the end, nurses recalled how he made them laugh. He was that person. He stayed with them. A man who could transform pain into performance and fear into comedy. A man who departed with joy rather than silence.